Hi, and welcome to Lesson 10 of your course on Web Analytics for the UCLA Extension. I'm Mike Moran. This lesson is on the future of Web Analytics. I'm the author of a couple of books on Internet marketing, Search Engine Marketing Inc., and Do It Wrong Quickly. Both of those books spend a lot of time of explaining how Web Analytics can be used in marketing. But honestly, they don't talk a lot about the future of web analytics. So we're going to spend time in this lesson to discuss that topic. Now, the reason that you need to understand the future of web analytics is because just like everything else on the web and in any form of digital technology, it's not enough to know what's already here. Although it's better to know what's already here than not to know it at all. It's important that you also understand what's coming. Not necessarily because you can do anything about it right now, but because you can pay attention and see how it evolves. You will be more on alert as you notice stories that talk about what kinds of things are changing. Because with every form of digital marketing, or really any job that is affected by technology at all, it's just as important to stay on top of what's changing as it is to be an expert in what's here now. Because if you look at any expertise in the digital world, what you'll find is that you could be an expert today, but if you wait 10 minutes, there'll be something that comes along that you don't understand. So it's a process of constantly learning. And there's nothing about this class that's going to prevent you from having to learn. You're still going to be stuck learning just like everybody else is. What I'm hoping is that by paying attention to this module, what will happen for you is that the blizzard of changes that come along in web analytics, and there will be a blizzard just as there are with everything else, that blizzard of changes will be something that you will at least have a framework to think about. It will at least give you a way of looking at what kinds of changes are coming so that you'll be able to slot them into various categories and understand which ones are more important for you than for others. Because not every change in web analytics is one that will affect you personally. Depending on the business you work for or the kinds of clients you have, if you're a consultant, some kinds of changes will be much more likely to affect you than others. And so as you're going through this lesson, think about which ones will have the most effect on you as they occur. And my crystal ball is cloudy, so even though these are the things that I see coming, you're certain to see things come along that I haven't clued you in on. But at least that'll be the minority. At least most of the things that are changing are things that you'll have some understanding of, and you'll be ready to move on it. So one thing that you always need to take into account when you're talking about the future of anything is the William Gibson rule. For those of you who don't know William Gibson, he wrote a very interesting novel called Neuromancers, and in that book he had a very interesting quote called, "The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed." So one of the things that you take from that quote is that when we talk about the future of web analytics, or honestly the future of just about anything in digital marketing or digital technology, you always have to consider who the audience is. Now in this case, I think I know who the audience is, and I think you understand from the first 9 lessons of this course what it is that is state of the art for web analytics today. But one of the things you need to be equipped to do is to be able to discuss the future of web analytics with other people at your company or with your clients. And one of the things you need to understand when you're discussing future possibilities is that you always have to understand the level of knowledge that that person has about the subject today. So you can't assume that just because someone somewhere is doing something, that everyone knows about it. So the point of this quote is to help you to think through the fact that things that are going on today and that from an industry point of view would be considered the present are still in the future for many, many people. So if things are only being done by a very small percentage of people, that means for the great majority of people, these things are the future because they're not doing them yet. And so one of the things I want to do to start our discussion of the future in web analytics is to talk about things that currently exist, but they're just not evenly distributed. They haven't been done everywhere yet. They're not common knowledge. They're not typical best practices. They're things that are good, they're important, but they're not things that everybody's doing. And so when you start thinking about the future of web analytics, you have to think about the future for your company or for each client, client by client, because a lot of their future is actually someone else's present. And so what we want to start with now is to talk about what kinds of things are here now that are not being done very widely. And so these are probably the places to start with clients who are in the average realm for web analytics. They're doing most of the average things, but they're not doing anything terribly cutting edge. So these are the kinds of things that you've heard about before in this course that are cutting edge and that most people aren't doing yet. So let's look at the first kind of web analytics that is considered a best practice that most people will give lip service to, but in my experience most people aren't doing, and that's return on investment. So earlier in the course we did discuss how return on investment works. So we actually had a whole module on return on investment where we gave you the formula. We talked about two kinds of ROI, one being how to measure it transactionally. More companies are doing this than are measuring it relationally, but many companies don't do it at all. And so as you bring these principles out of the classroom and into your workplace, you have to focus on the fact that it might not be some very exciting, futuristic thing that you need to do in your organization. You might need to do something that you would consider after taking this course to be rather basic, which is to understand how the investment that you're making in marketing is returned in sales. And so think clearly about where your clients are or where your company is. Think clearly about what they can already do. Because the first thing you might need to do, the future of web analytics for them, might not be some kind of far-reaching thing that I'll explain to you today. Instead, it might be something extremely state-of-the-art, something everybody, quote, everyone knows who's in the field, but that isn't being done where you are. And so transactional ROI is very frequently found in e-commerce companies. It's also frequently found for companies that are using extensive paid search budgets. But for a lot of other internet marketing, it's pretty common not to see even transactional ROI. It's fairly common to see that companies are making marketing investments. It could be in organic search, it could be in email marketing, it could be in social media. They're doing all these kinds of things, but they really don't know how to measure their return on investment, even transactionally. And in fact, B2B companies are probably the worst in this area, where they are the furthest behind. They are the ones with the fewest measurements of return on investment for their marketing. In part, it's because B2B companies often don't have any kind of history of doing marketing at all. For them, marketing was figuring out what collateral to print to bring to the trade show. So they don't have a culture of marketing. They especially don't have a culture of direct marketing. And so for them, just trying to understand how to implement direct marketing principles so that they can get to the fact that they can measure transactional ROI is a critical step for them for the future. Now, relational ROI is even less widely distributed. Very few companies do relational ROI. There are some companies that really do focus on that. I know for sure that there are a number of really large e-commerce companies that do focus on relational ROI. Once they understand what the average worth is of a client that they're able to attract, they skew their marketing budget towards customer acquisition and bringing those new clients in using relational ROI measures. But this is a very small percentage of companies. And so we have to keep in mind that those companies need help to do the basics before they're ready to do something bigger. So another area we covered previously that is critically important for companies, and it's one that you might not think about as expressly as you need to, is understanding which of the metrics are really important and being able to explain it to business people that don't have a web analytics background. So we talked before about how there are so many different names that we web analysts give to what's essentially the same thing. It doesn't really matter what you call it: an email open, a page view, an ad impression. All of those things essentially mean the same thing, which is it's an impression of some marketing content. And the same thing's true for click-throughs or mouse overs. As long as it causes the next step to happen, that's what you really need to know. There's no reason to look at click-throughs and mouse overs as being somehow completely distinct. They're not. They're basically saying that the visitor was interested in going deeper into the experience. It answers the question of whether they chose to go deeper with the marketing material. And obviously conversions are really important as well. And even though there are many, many different kinds of conversions, the truth is that that's what we're aiming for. So how do we get them to do those things? So that's what the marketing measurements are about. But there's a deeper issue here. Too often, the current state of the art of web analytics is about reports. It's about showing how we did this month to last month. Did we have more site visitors? Did we have more conversions? What did we do? Did we send more emails out? Did more people open them? And all those activity metrics are really important. They are. I don't want to make it sound like they're not. What I want you to think about in terms of the future of web analytics is how can you change the dynamic between the web analyst and the business decision makers so that it's not just about analysts feeding business people reports. How can you answer the questions and provide the data so that the decision makers can make better decisions? Those answers are not always in a monthly or a weekly report. And so what we need to do is to figure out how to use the data that we have to provide evidence for decisions to be made on one side or the other side of a question. So if we are trying to figure out which is the best copy for the email to send out, how can we run a test and use web analytics to prove which email is better? And I say prove in quotes. I mean, running a test doesn't prove anything, right? You can always run a test and have the test give you erroneous results. But it gives you evidence that that decision is correct. And that's what we really need to do, is to focus on metrics that are both simplified, as we see here. So instead of spending all this time trying to regale them with the details of all the different kinds of things, show them the kinds of things that they really care about and simplify it for them. And then show them how to think through testing hypotheses so that they can then make better decisions before they spend the real money. So how can you test a few different emails before you send out the one to the whole list? Those are the kinds of questions that web analysts have to help with. Too often today, web analysts are satisfied with making sure the data is being collected properly, checking to make sure that it's accurate, and producing a report that they then hand in. Maybe if they're really ambitious, they'll turn into slides and do a presentation about it. And all those things are helpful, useful, and give us an idea of where the business is going, much in the same way that accounting reports tell business people how their business is doing. But it doesn't necessarily help them make better decisions for the future. To do that, you have to do deeper analysis and you have to formulate tests. And you have to be doing this in conjunction with the business people. It's not the kind of thing that you can just collect all your data, print a report, throw it over the wall. You have to be in there with the business people. You have to be helping them make their decisions. You have to jump into action when you see that they have a decision they're confronting so that you can provide data that helps them make an informed decision. That's really where the future of web analytics is. The other thing that's coming that most companies don't do now is we have to seek more answers about causes. So right now, the companies that are doing a good job on web analytics, they do focus on some kinds of causes. So for example, they do focus on, what pages led to a buy, or they focus on what referrals they got that quote caused a visit. So someone searched for something on Google, you came up, they clicked on you, they came to your site, or they received an email alert and they came to your site, or they watched something on television and they came to your site. Now, some of these are easier to track than others, but it's not it's not out of the question that you can work through all these kinds of questions and figure out what kinds of marketing activities cause a particular site visit. What I think is going to happen in the future is going to be more attention to figuring out what even preceded that. So rather than thinking through, okay, well, someone searched for us on Google and they found us, maybe people are going to want to know, well, what caused them to search for us on Google? Or what kinds of social media have they been exposed to before that direct email that came in caused them to say, oh, yeah, I guess I am going to go look at them? Those are the kinds of questions that I think are going to be part of the future of web analytics. Now, one of the reasons we don't do a lot of that today is because it's really hard. It's extremely difficult to understand what the activity is of a person when they're working on sites that do not belong to you. So you can figure out what's going on your own website, but it's not that easy to figure out what particular users are doing when they're in other parts of the web. And so those kinds of things, there are some solutions for at least part of that problem, and there will be more coming in the future. So one of the things I think we're going to see is that we're going to be seeking more answers about the causes of behavior, because that's what's going to help us figure out how we can do more things to cause that behavior to happen more frequently and with more people. So how do these impressions occur? How do those things that happen before someone comes to your site, what kinds of things are people doing? So as we said, it's not always on your site, and it's not even on your owned media that's off-site. So when we talk about owned media, we mean this is the kind of content that you control as a company. So obviously, all of the content on your website is owned media. All the content in email messages you mail out is owned media. TV ads you run, owned media. All those kinds of things are owned media. In addition, lots of social media marketing is also owned media. So if you make a video and you post it on YouTube, that's material that you own. You've created it. And all of this is in contrast to two other kinds of media: earned media and paid media. So paid media is advertising, so paid search ads, banner or display ads, and in a sense TV ads are paid media as well. I think I called it owned media before, but if you pay for it, you should consider it paid media. Earned media is what was traditionally had been in the realm of public relations. So public relations is at the behest of the media channels that are willing to put a story out. So your PR person or communications person, as many like to be called today, they will be cultivating relationships with editors, with reporters, with people who are the gatekeepers of getting messages onto particular channels. And so that earned media occurs on the internet as well. A lot of social media is actually earned media because it is tweets that other people make about you, it's blog posts that they write about you. And so all these kinds of things need to be thought about. Um, and how do you know which ones of those are persuasive? How do you know which of those things, whether it's owned media, earned media, or paid media, how do you know which ones are the ones that are causing people to come to your site? So here's another future is now situation. For many of these owned media and paid media opportunities, the way to identify that they have had an impact and they have brought someone to your site is through tracking codes. But even though tracking codes are fairly well understood, in my experience, they are very rarely used in a lot of these situations. Almost no companies are using tracking codes for social media, for example. Display ads usually have tracking systems, whether they're through the display ad network or whether people are actually using tracking codes. Those are the kinds of things that are fairly well understood and done. Email is usually fairly well tracked as well. Paid search is usually well tracked. But there's a lot of businesses that don't really know how to use tracking codes. And I think most businesses do not understand how to do it with social media. And that's a huge, huge opportunity. So even though these are things that are well understood, they're not a future of web analytics for the industry, as we said before. Most companies don't do them. And so this is a place to start if you're trying to help your company move into the future. So you might remember this slide. This is how you calculate transactional return on investment. And so, again, many companies still don't track return on investment, even for transactions. And so one of the really important things you need to do is to focus on the basics. Don't just walk in there and try and give them advice for things that are nice and smart and futuristic and best practices, but completely unrealistic for the situation you're walking into. The first thing you need to do is assess the situation and understand which things that you've learned already, far beyond what kind of futuristic stuff is out there, which things that you already have in your arsenal, which of those things are not being done, or they're not being done properly. And this is one of the big ones. Most companies are not doing a good job of tracking transactional ROI. Even those companies that do track transactional ROI often are only tracking it for certain kinds of marketing investments. They may possibly be tracking transactional ROI for paid search, but not for organic. They might be tracking it for display ads, but not for social media. And so again, in the first part of this presentation, I want to hit you over the head with the message. One of the most important things to understand about the future is a lot of the things that you need to do in the future are already being done by someone else, perhaps even your competitor. Now, as we move on, you'll see many of the things that we've talked about in the past are not being done by many customers at all. So one of the things that we really focused on in an earlier lesson was to find your best customers and really look at this as a kind of market segmentation. So it's not enough for you to only focus on transactional. There are very few companies for which transactional ROI is the right answer. The great majority of businesses will be able to more easily sell more of their product line to existing customers than to acquire new customers. So you may hear people talking about share of wallet, where what they're really saying is, of all of the money that my customers budget for things that I sell, what percentage of it do I get? And your goal is to get 100. I mean, if you do a really good job on your products and services, you should be able to consistently make inroads against your competition with your best customers. And so one of the things is to understand who are your best customers. So when we talked about this the last time, we explained that your best customers are really the ones who are the most profitable, not necessarily the ones that spend the most revenue with you. You might have customers that have high revenue, these royal customers that we have in the upper right, but they also cost a lot to serve. And so they're not they're not really the right ones, right? I mean, and the ones in the lower right, I mean, they're kind of the royal pain customers where they're incredibly painful to service, and they don't give you that much revenue anyway. So so the ones in the bottom that really are low revenue customers, you want to move them up, and the royal customers, you want to move them to the left. And so identifying who your best customers are through relational ROI techniques is one of the most important ways of increasing share of wallet, because the most valuable customers are the ones that you want the most share of wallet with. So we also talked previously about lifetime value. And one of the things we discovered about it is it's pretty hard to calculate. And I don't know of too many companies that calculate it in real time. But more and more, web analytics is going to be used to make real-time decisions, possibly for personalized offers, where someone comes to the site and by identifying who they are, understanding what their value is, possibly understanding their transactional value, but in the future, understanding their their predicted lifetime value in real time, you can change the way your website operates so that you can be personalizing offers, you can be changing which kinds of pages are being offered as links to them. There's all sorts of things that you're able to do with a dynamic website. And by having web analytics underlying those website rules that cause those different personalized features to fire, that will make an enormous difference in how successful they are. And so web analytics, we've talked already how a lot of web analysts are stuck kind of in the reporting mode. And we urged you earlier to move to the mode of how do you help business people make decisions. But there's yet another move that you can make, which is to be helping the computer make better decisions based on web analytics. And so those real-time decisions of what content is going to be shown once you get in front of a qualified prospect or an existing customer, those are critical decisions that web analytics can play an enormous part in. And so in addition to you needing to get close to those business people who are making those decisions offline, you also have to expand your thinking about what a web analyst's job is so that you're getting close to the people who are designing the user experience. And because those people would love to be able to make things more dynamic, more personalized, more persuasive for the people who are looking at it, and they may not understand the kinds of web analytics, the kinds of metrics that could be fed into the computer for each person who comes to the site or for groups of people. You might not be able to identify someone as being a particular customer, but maybe you could identify them as being a particular type of customer, a particular market segment. And so by aggregating everything you know in web analytics about different market segments, that can give you a real opportunity as well. And there's plenty of ways that you'll be able to do this. So things like reverse IP lookup can help you understand geographically where someone's located. It might also be able to identify what company they work for, especially if it's a larger company. And there are many other ways that people can identify themselves, whether it's from cookieing or user ID systems. So all these ways of people being identified can help you to understand not only what markets that they're in, but also who they are and maybe personally identify them. And so help your uh, uh, programmers, help your user experience people to understand what kind of web analytics is available depending on how much information they know about each visitor. And so measuring lifetime value in real time, measuring transactional ROI in real time, measuring the propensity to take certain actions in real time, all of these things are opportunities for you to make web analytics more valuable to the business. Now, there's two big issues that I think will drive a lot of the future of web analytics. The first one is, how do we link together the content and understand its persuasiveness? And the second one is, how do we know who's looking at each piece of content? And these problems are related because they both have to do with taking fragmented metrics that we have today and linking them together. They also have to do with uncovering metrics that right now are really hard to collect. And so why do I say that? Well, let's look at the first issue. So we talked earlier about trying to understand the causes. We want to know what caused people to do something. And so there's a couple of different ways to think about that. One is what caused someone to come to your site. The other is what caused someone to take action. Because coming to your site is only a kind of action, right? The other actions are moving forward in the experience once they get to the site, actually converting. All those kinds of things have to do with persuasiveness. And so there's a holistic kind of thought process that we need to have that says what eventually causes a conversion is actually the sum total of all of the content that prospect was exposed to before they made a purchase. And so how do we link together all that content? Right now, we don't really do a good job of doing that. We don't really think clearly about even all the different pages in our web experience that someone looked at before they bought. We might pay attention to the fact that they converted from a particular page, but we typically don't look at all of the different pages they saw before that and link that together. And if you think about it, it's a pattern. We could look at all the pages on our site as a pattern. Certain patterns might lead to winning combinations, right? Where if people look at certain pages, they're more likely to convert than maybe if they have a different pattern of looking at pages. And by looking at that, it might help us change the navigation on the site. It might help us change some of the pages that are locked in bad patterns. So all those kinds of things are possible and could be done today, except most companies don't do them. But we can go much further than that. How do we link together the content that even is not on our site? So we talked before about owned content, earned content, and paid content. Well, as we think about that, what is it that we're looking at to try and link those things together? How do we know, how do we make the pattern even deeper? Where we can say, okay, well, they looked at this YouTube video before they came to the site, where they searched for this and found this search results page, and then they clicked on us and came to the site. So by looking at those patterns, it can help us improve our conversion rates. And I think the issues of how we link together that full content experience, how do we know all of the different messages they were exposed to, whether they're on our site or not, that's going to be one of the big issues of really making web marketing more persuasive, and that's going to be a big part of where web analysts come in. And I said the second idea was related, and it is because often today we have a hard time understanding who the person is. We might know that they're a repeat visitor, but the only reason we know that is because they were cookied. We might not know what their handle is on Twitter, or what their blog is that they're writing on, or which message boards they frequent and possibly contribute to. We don't have the ability to tie all that activity back into a single person. We might know that different user IDs did that. We might have some ability to tie things together. But even on our own site, a lot of companies don't do a good job of understanding who the visitors are that are returning to the site. So even though it's a fairly simple uh, way of doing it with cookies or with user IDs, there's lots of ways to provide people incentives to use user IDs so that you would know who they were when they come back. Most companies don't do it. So we're going to look at 10 trends that I think will depict the future of web analytics. Now, as I said before, I don't have a high degree of confidence in my own ability to see the future. So even though I'm giving you these 10 trends, it's possible a couple of them are wrong. It's much more likely that I've missed a couple of important trends, but I'm hoping that by giving you these kinds of categories of the changes that are to come, that will help you to understand what it is that you ought to be looking for as you see events unfold. And so the first trend is awareness metrics. So we've spent a lot of time emphasizing direct marketing, and I would argue that that's still the right emphasis to have. But there is a concept in marketing called brand awareness. And so far, it's gotten fairly short shrift. In the beginning, people used to talk about brand awareness, but it was only because they really couldn't prove return on investment. They couldn't prove that a transaction was occurring. And so they used to focus on things like, I remember famously that there were people who used to spend a lot of time focusing on the impressions of paid search ads. And the reason they would focus on that is because their ads weren't getting a lot of clicks. And so they would focus on the impressions of the paid search ad and tell you how great the brand awareness must be that you've got that many impressions on your paid search ad. Well, the truth is that you're not getting a lot of awareness because if someone isn't clicking on it, you don't really even know if they looked at it. So a lot of the stuff that was claimed for brand awareness in the past, I would argue, is rather spurious. But as we've talked about already, one of the key issues is going to be understanding how you can measure where your prospects come from, because that helps you understand where you should be putting the emphasis in your resources. And so awareness metrics are a critical area for web analytics to expand, even though most of them occur before they get to your site. So we talked before about owned media, paid media, and earned media. So we talked about how owned media is stuff on your website, it's emails you send out, it's social media that you control. Paid media is advertising. So it's display ads, it's paid search. Earned media is more the public relations things. It's the kinds of things that you've had some kind of information written about you or about your products, and there may be things that you did to cause that to happen the way public relations people do, or it may have just happened organically and someone just heard about you, thought it was an interesting story, and wrote about it. So all these things are things that we're trying to measure, and that's good. One of the things that's rare is a company that ties them all together, a company that really can identify which kinds of content are on which subjects, which of them are tied to marketing campaigns for which products. How do we measure how those things work together to make all of them better than they would be individually? So what's the effect of paid media on owned media and earned media? I mean, if you do a lot more advertising, will people write about you more? If you do a lot more advertising, will people be more persuaded by your owned media? I don't think there's been a lot of work here. And so there's been a tendency for people to look at owned media and earned media as more valuable because they don't have to spend as much money on it. So it seems like it has a higher return on investment. And that might in fact be true. But what if what's happening is that the paid media is actually causing more people to pay attention to the owned and earned media? I know one company that I worked with that used to attribute all of the searches that had their brand name in it to their television and radio advertising. They gave the advertising the credit for those searches, not search as a marketing tactic. Now, why did they do that? They did that because their assumption was that it was their paid media that was driving the name recognition that caused someone to type that into the search box. And so those kinds of things are things that you have to make decisions on. You have to think through how you're going to connect these kinds of media together so that you're attributing the right sources, so that you're understanding what kinds of things are happening out there. So let's look at some of the awareness metrics that we might want to measure. So one of the things you need to think about is, what's the use case that you're using that measurement applies to? So here's a good example of when you have to think about that, because you have to make sure you're listening to enough. So Twitter has tens of millions of tweets every day. And the question is, how much of that do you have to listen to? In order to track awareness, what do you need to know? So if you're doing market research, where you're just trying to understand what the trends are in the market, what kinds of things people are talking about, what the subjects are, whether they are positive or negative about your brand, your products, you can sample. You don't have to look at every blessed tweet every day in order to do that right. Because Twitter has a product that it sells for a lot of money called the Fire Hose that has all of the tweets in it. They also have something called the Garden Hose that has about 20% of the tweets in it, and they also have an API that, again, will not give you back all the tweets if it's a subject that has an awful lot of tweets associated with it. And so you can sample them if you're doing market research. But if you're doing something like crisis management, where you're trying from a PR point of view to understand what kinds of things are being said about you in a difficult situation, then you need to see everything. You can't really let something go and say, well, we only get 20%, that's okay. Customer service is the same way. I would argue that if you're doing lead management, if you're trying to identify prospects on Twitter and engage with them, which a number of companies are starting to do right now, you also need the fire hose. And so understanding what kinds of awareness metrics you're trying to follow and knowing your use case, that's what's really important to help you understand whether you're listening to enough or not. So let's look at certain social media metrics and understand that most companies are not using social media right now as a place for web analytics. These all things are possible, so these aren't metrics that don't exist yet. We'll talk about some of those later, but these are metrics that most companies aren't using. So the first measurement that most companies are interested in social media is volume. So what do we mean by volume? We mean how many conversations are going on out there about us or about our products. And so they might think to themselves, let's count all the tweets about us, let's count all the blog posts about us, all the blog comments, all the videos made about us. Let's just count all those things. Every Facebook status that is publicly available. Those are all things that we'll count. We'll figure out what the volume is. And then they want volume to go up. Let's have more volume next month. Let's have more the month after that. Let's do things to cause more people to talk about us. And at face value, that seems reasonable, but in many situations that can be misleading. Why? Well, the first is collection bias. So what's collection bias? Collection bias means that you are paying attention to what you can collect even though you haven't collected anything. Facebook's a good example of this. There's lots of information out there on Facebook, but most of it isn't public. Some of it is. And so you can collect that and measure it, but there might be a lot of information that isn't public. And that might not be an issue in and of itself because, hey, the volume's the volume. Whatever you can collect, you collect. But think about this. If you're judging yourself about whether it's good, whether volume goes up or not, then as Facebook loosens its privacy policies and more of that data becomes public, your volume's going to go up even though nothing has really happened except the collection has become easier. This happened with Twitter when they introduced the fire hose. Before that, there was a limit to how much anybody could know about what was being tweeted. But once the fire hose came in, you immediately had a 5 times increase in how many tweets could be collected. And so just looking at volume doesn't really help you very much. It also doesn't help you for another reason, which is the volume of social media participation is increasing every day, regardless of what you're doing. And so your volume ought to be going up, even if you're not doing anything. Even if you're doing dumb things, the volume's probably going up because the volume's going up for everything. And so simply looking at volume is not necessarily the way that you want to go. So the other thing that it's agnostic about is sentiment. If you do something really stupid, people might talk about it, but I'm not sure that's good for you. You know, if your company's involved in a recall, if the head of one of your divisions said something terrible in the media, any of these things can cause you to have enormous volume increases, but it's not necessarily good for you. And so simply looking at volume isn't really where you need to be. So let's look at how you think through sentiment and how that's measured. So sentiment analysis is the technical name for understanding whether a piece of text is positive or negative. And so a lot of social media listening vendors can provide sentiment analysis that's done automatically. And so it can show you the percentage of conversations that are positive or negative about whatever subject you're interested in. And those things are important. Automated sentiment can handle a lot of these questions, and it handles it quite cheaply. It would be difficult for many companies, especially large ones, to have human beings look at every single conversation and make the decision of whether it was positive or negative. That could be quite expensive. And so it makes a lot of sense that we want to rely on automated computer methods. Those are called text analytics, to provide sentiment analysis, because that's a way of not only doing it very quickly, so that if you're in crisis management, you'll see positive and negative stories right away, but it also allows it to be done quite cheaply. But as you might expect, there are limits to the accuracy of automated sentiment analysis. So let's talk about what those things are. One of them is the failure to identify sarcasm. So here's an example where it says, oh, the iPhone is a beautiful girl, no doubt. Now you as a human being listening to that can automatically detect that that's sarcastic, and that there's going to be a but that follows it, and it's going to be something very negative. But automated sentiment analysis often would code this as positive for the iPhone, because it didn't realize that the author was saying that there's a beautiful flashy exterior, but that it wasn't something that was valuable overall. And so that's a sarcastic response. And so sarcasm is quite difficult for automated listening algorithms to detect sentiment in. Another problem for automated algorithms is that there's often sentiment that is only understood within a context, and it's a context that computers might not understand. Well, let me give you an example. So you might have someone who tweeted, "I spent my entire lunch hour online at so-and-so bank." Now, an automated sentiment analysis algorithm would not find any words in there that seem positive or negative, so it might code that neutral. But you and I know that that was negative, because we know that the person wasn't happy about spending an hour online, and that spending an hour online is really not a great thing. It could also be that they were exaggerating and they didn't spend an hour online. They only spent 15 minutes online, but they expressed it as though they spent an hour online. And as human beings, we are used to understanding those nuances at the moment, and this can always change. At the moment, computer algorithms don't do a very good job on that at all. Another thing that's quite difficult for computer algorithms is to identify multiple opinions within the same passage. So within a blog post, for example, you might have several positive things and several negative things that are all different opinions. And so the automated algorithm has trouble picking those apart. It has trouble identifying that there are different opinions within the same text. And so the computer might say it's mixed or it's neutral. There are some automated listening platforms out there that code 70 or 80% of brand mentions as neutral or mixed, which is not all that helpful. And so the state of the art in automated sentiment analysis is not quite where everybody would like to be yet. And so one of the things that you might want to do is to look for ways of augmenting the automated sentiment analysis with human analysts. And so that will help you to clean up a lot of this information to find the things that are really actionable. So let's look at some other advanced social awareness metrics. So we talked earlier about how volume was a little bit misleading. So you could look at volume as a share of overall competition, overall conversation. So share of voice, where, relative to the volume increasing, are you increasing your share of the conversation against your competitors? That would be a more interesting way to look at whether your volume is increasing. You can also look at relative sentiment among competitors. So often comparing yourself to competitors is really important, and also looking at the popularity of topics. Those kinds of things can help you understand what the conversation is about. Any of those things are things that might make a lot of sense for you to be focused on, and those are things that many companies are not doing today. So here's another more advanced visualization. And visualizations itself is going to be one of the trends that you'll see in web analytics, is that you'll have better and better visualizations of what kind of information we're seeing. And here's an example. So how do the conversations in social media relate to each other? So in this visualization, the size of the half circle is the volume of conversation. And we talked earlier about volume being kind of a misleading metric, but it's not misleading in a snapshot in time, because what this volume is looking at is the various volumes of different types of conversations in the same time frame. It's when you start comparing volume over time that it could become misleading. You also see that each of those half circles, semicircles, are split into positive, negative, and neutral. So that gives you an idea of the tenor of the conversation. Now, one of the more interesting parts of this graph that you don't see that often is the width of the connecting lines, and the darkness of the connecting lines is about the relationship between those topics. So you will see that some topics seem to go hand in hand with other topics, and some don't. And by looking at the relationships, that can help you understand what kinds of things people seem to discuss together and what things they seem to discuss separately. So one of the things to contrast as we try and think of the future of web analytics is the difference between how you find hot topics today and how you will find them tomorrow. So today, you might not get the full fire hose, especially if you're just using something for free. One way to look for hot topics is just to use Twitter search. So you don't want to necessarily only use keywords, right? Keywords might be a different way to identify all tweets on a certain topic. So you might want to use hashtags, because a hashtag ostensibly is a human being deciding that their tweet is on a certain subject. So in this example, we're looking at the hashtag for Egypt and looking at what tweets come up that are tagged that way. And that can be a very good way of finding trending topics on Twitter. A little harder to do the same thing on blogs or on other kinds of social media because they don't have the concept of a hashtag. And so for those, you really are stuck with keywords, and it's not necessarily so that just because something has a keyword in it that it's on that subject, or something is not on that subject if it fails to have that keyword. And so all those things are things that you need to think through when you're trying to figure out how to find hot topics, and that makes searching for hot topics today not a terribly simple thing to do. Let's contrast that to what is becoming possible and will be fairly commonplace in the future, which is something called meme tracking. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the concept of a meme, it's actually a word that connotes a particular type of subject, and usually it's connoting that that subject is beginning to become popular, it's trending. And so that meme is actually a kind of thought or opinion that is being conveyed throughout a larger part of the populace than it was before. And so one of the things you're trying to do, so one way of thinking about looking for emerging topics is to be looking for memes that are starting to trend upward in terms of volume. And so how can you think about meme tracking? So meme tracking, one way to think about it in Twitter is retweets, right? But that doesn't really tell you that it's about a subject. That can tell you the trending of particular tweets. And what you do is you want something at a higher level than that. You like to be able to use text analytics to categorize tweets as being about certain subjects, possibly quite detailed and specific subjects, and then recognize those subjects as being the memes. And then by automatically categorizing them, you can then count how many tweets, and you can also apply this to blog posts, Facebook status updates, YouTube videos. There's all sorts of things you can apply it to that would allow you to understand what that tweet is about and what that blog post is about or that video is about, and you can assign it a certain type of subject or meme, and then you can count those in the aggregate, and that can help you see that there's many different tweets or videos or blog posts all about a very important subject, and it's starting to gain traction. And you can also be testing to see whether it's positive or negative by using sentiment analysis. So that's it for the first trend. Let's look at the second trend, which is deep segmentation. Now, we talked previously about segmentation, and when we did, we talked about how it's extremely difficult to make an overall improvement when you use a test. So let's say you're trying to improve conversion rate. So it's very difficult to test changes that will result in an improvement to overall conversion rate. I'm not saying that there aren't any you can do, but you'll probably run out of them fairly quickly. And instead, it's a lot simpler to identify particular segments of the population. So they could be people who came from certain sites or whose IP addresses mark them as being from certain locations, or people who landed on particular pages, or people who use certain search queries. There's all sorts of ways to do segmentation. And if you can segment your data based on that segmentation, so that you can identify which segments seem to, for example, have higher conversion rates or lower conversion rates, that can inform your marketing in a couple ways. First, you can see if there's something that's more appealing about the message to one segment or another. You might be able to start personalizing the message by segments, so you can have different segments going to different kinds of pages. You might also decide that what's really happening is that certain segments are more qualified than others, and so you might want to put more of your marketing budget to attracting those segments. All of those things make it much easier to raise your conversion rate in this example. Now, the trend that I see, first of all, I don't see that many companies are doing segmentation. Some are. The really most advanced ones are doing segmentation. Many companies are doing very little in terms of segmentation. And so that's a critical area to focus on. But the other thing that I see coming is that there's going to be much deeper ways of doing segmentation. And the more ways you have to segment, the more opportunities you have to use that data analysis in order to improve the metrics that you're focused on. So what kinds of things can we look at as areas that might start to emerge for segmentation? So one of them I mentioned already, which is location. Not that many companies use reverse IP lookup, and so they don't know what location people are from. There are services out there that given an IP address can give you a relatively correct location, relatively accurate location about where the visitor is, and so those can be helpful in terms of segmentation. There's also a possibility of starting to segment based on online and offline activities. So we talked earlier about the challenge of being able to tie together different online activities that people did before they came to your site. There's also the need to do that with offline activities as well. How can you identify what people do after they come to your site? Perhaps they converted on the web, but they didn't buy, so they had to go offline to buy. What are the kinds of things they did offline after they left your site? So you might keep track of the fact of whether they bought or not, and a lot of companies don't even do that. But you might also want to keep track of what are the things that they did in that buying process. Those are things that might help you become more persuasive as well. Demographics. So today we mostly don't know very much about the people that come to our site. So if we're able to offer many more personalization features that users find valuable, they'll be much more likely to want to provide information. They'll be more likely to want to accept cookies from our site. They'll be more likely to want to have a user ID. All those things will allow us to know more about the people who come and then make the information more personalized to them, which should make the information more persuasive as well. Psychographics, attitudes and opinions. So what is it how could you get that kind of psychographics? Well, you might be able to understand it if people are willing to sign in, for example, with their Twitter handle, or sign in with their Facebook handle, and they'll share their information with you. If you can come up with a reason that will let them do that, that would allow you to then start mining that data so you understood more about who they are, and that would help you understand how to segment them better. Firmographics. So we've talked about demographics for people. Firmographics for B2B helps you understand what company you're dealing with, what industry are they in, how large are they, where are they located. All of those things can help you provide more persuasive information to them. And Reverse IP lookup is a way that you can get firmographic data as well, because there are services out there that help you understand what the what the company IP address is, and so then you can use a lookup table to help you know what industry they're in and all that other firmographic information about them. Friends information. So one of the things that's starting to happen is that we talked before about how you might be able to mine tweet streams and Facebook status for attitudes and opinions. You can also sometimes get the same kind of information about people in their network, and it could be that they haven't expressed much of an opinion about your company or your products, but maybe their friends have, and so it might be very helpful to get that information. And then some of those things are starting to emerge on Twitter. If you can share a person's handle, you can already get information about who follows them, and you can then mine their streams, or you can get information about who that person follows. And so any of those things might help you to understand their network a little better. On Facebook, the rules change all the time. They are constantly becoming looser, and I think at some point you might be able to get that information on Facebook. Third trend, unified identity. So we mentioned this earlier, but I wanted to identify it specifically as a trend, is trying to understand cross-venue activity, so all the kinds of things that people do in all the different parts of the web when they come, and then when they come to your site. But we're also looking at offline activity as well. So how can we look at these things and try and identify that all of these different identities, whether it's the Twitter handle, the Facebook ID, the blog post ID, all those kinds of things, how can you know that this is the same person? How can you link together all that activity to give you a much better picture of who you're dealing with? Now there's some level of creepiness involved here. There's some people who will find this to be very big brotherish, and so we have to really pay attention to that. But on the other hand, this is a very powerful way of providing better service to the customer as well, and more personalized information, things that are more relevant to them. So how do we do those kinds of things in a way that protects their privacy and does not raise the specter of regulation or other kinds of things? One of the ways I would think would be to make what you're doing so valuable that customers want you to do this. And so that's really, you have to give to get. You have to give them something in order to in order to get the information from them. And so the same is true with offline activity. How can you pull together the kinds of things they do before and after they leave your website? How can you use so for example, there's all sorts of information available based on loyalty cards, where there's all sorts of activities, there's purchase histories, there's all sorts of things that you can get from that. Who's taking that information and tying it into what happens online? Um, if you use loyalty cards, are you asking for the loyalty card number when someone sets up an identity on your website? So you may have all this great loyalty data, but are you giving them credit for those discounts online just as you do offline? And are you tying that data together? And are you looking at what they tend to buy online and offline? And are you using both channels to reinforce the other? That's just one example of pulling offline activity in. And so just as we talked about content, it's hard to kind of track all that content together, right? You would rather track memes, you'd rather track owned, earned, and paid together, but it's hard to do. It's really hard to track people as well. It's easier to track IP addresses and say, well, this is, or cookies, and say this is a returning visitor. It's like, well, that's great, but what else do I know about them? So it's also easier to track user IDs. So if you can get people to sign up as a user, that can really help you. But the problem is that getting them to sign up on your site as a user doesn't tell you what their Twitter handle is. And so all these kinds of things are issues that we really need to focus on, because this will give us a bigger and better and more accurate picture of who the customers are and that will allow us to then do more segmentation. It'll also allow us to make messages more persuasive. So what are the ways that you could link identity, online identity? So could you look at aggregation services? So Google is able to pull together a lot of different identities together, and there's ways of querying the Google API in order to pull those back. There's a service that is not as popular as it was a few years ago called Friend Feed. So if your client is signed up for Friend Feed, that's a place where they might have disclosed their Twitter handle, their Facebook ID, their blog. I mean, all those kinds of things could have been done. Um, Other ways of looking at it is with crawling. So can you crawl people's Twitter profiles and see what other sites they've linked to in their profile? Can you use IP addresses to identify people as being the same as someone who came previously? So there's a lot of ways of looking at this. None of these work beautifully, but possibly all of them working together might give you some kind of feeling that you're on the right track. And as we mentioned before, this is an area where regulation may have a big impact on what's possible in web analytics. So don't put it past governments to heavily regulate the ability to remain anonymous, to prevent commercial concerns from linking together these identities across different sites. That might happen. And so to me, one of the things that web analysts really need to do is to help their companies make very clear privacy policies to really explain to the visitors what it is that they are giving up. The more you try and sneak this stuff past your visitor, the more likely that the government is going to walk in and tell you what you're allowed to do and not allowed to do. The more that you try and make this a very open transaction, where you're explaining all the things you're doing and you're providing value to the customer so the customer is willingly turning this information over to you, the less the government will feel the need to be involved. So that helped us understand how we might unify online identities, but what about online and offline activity? Now, we talked earlier about things like shopper loyalty cards. So that's a key area that not too many companies are doing a good job with. And we also want to go beyond some of the things that we've talked about in the past. So we've talked about how you can have phone numbers on your website that are used nowhere else. So if people call them, you know they were on your website. There are also companies that have done things like used a different phone number on every page of their website, so that they actually know which page you were on when you called. It's possible for you to use a unique phone number for every visitor to your website. You can personalize the site. You can decide whether you can look at each visitor that comes in, and you can have that phone number appear on every page they visit throughout their session and have that be a unique number. And so if that phone number gets called, you can immediately go back to the web metrics activity. I haven't seen that kind of thing being done, but I believe that it makes a lot of sense, and it's something that you might want to consider if you're really serious about tying this stuff together. I mean, we've talked before about couponing, where you can get people to print a coupon and walk into a retail store and buy something, and that coupon's only available on the web, so that lets you know they came from your website. But just as with the phone number, there isn't any real reason why you can't have a separate coupon for every visitor who comes to your site, where that identifies them uniquely when that gets turned in, and so you know which visitor session actually led to that coupon coming in. So these kinds of things are much deeper in terms of how to unify online and offline activity. You can also use mobile phone activity. So more and more people are using the web from their mobile phone, and the mobile phone often gives you information that you might not get in other ways. Like, for example, on Twitter, when someone tweets from a mobile phone, usually their location is disclosed, even though they may not have typically said that they want location to be part of their activity. As we go to mobile payment systems, which are coming soon, In a sense, they're already here, but they're not widely used yet. Those mobile phone payment systems might be able to give you a lot of information about where a person was, and depending on how the arrangements are made, maybe there are ways to even get more information about the person when they're using their phone. We'll talk about this a little more later, but the other thing that you really need to think through is how you integrate customer relationship management and business intelligence systems into your web analytics, because they have a wealth of data about what customers do offline. And so if you can tap into that, that's going to give you the opportunity to really embellish your online metrics. So the fourth trend we want to look at is influence metrics. So we talked about trying to measure awareness and where people are coming from, and just looking at the activity they have and trying to understand what persuaded them. But one of the things that might have persuaded them was a piece of content or a person. And so might we want to measure who are the influential people, for example, because we would like to treat them differently. Just as public relations people reach out to reporters because they're influential, more influential than the average person because of the podium that they have to speak from, there are undoubtedly consumers who are more influential than others, who have opinions, who share them. And so the first question we have to ask when we look at influence metrics is, what are we trying to measure the influence of? People or content? And you'll see that it's kind of a sticky question, because it's not that simple to necessarily tease those two things apart. Every piece of content is more or less influential based on what you know about the person who produced that content. And an influential person might have a really dumb opinion. And so even though they are in general influential, that piece of content they produced wasn't influential. So it's not something that you can just tease apart one versus the other and know exactly what you're getting. So if you look at how influence is measured today, so there are sites that purport to measure the influence of people on Twitter, for example. So Twitter Grader was an early one. It's been, I'd say, many more people are using Clout right now as their idea of an influencer site. But I like Twitter Grader better because it gives me a 98 and I only have a 45 on Clout. So I say Twitter Grader is great. But honestly, I think Clout gives a much more effective analysis of people's true influence. But all those things are just formulas. So they look at how many followers or fans you have, how many postings, how often those postings are passed along, and they have a lot of different metrics. But the truth is that it's a formula. And so it might give you some idea of someone's influence, but it's relatively flawed because it's hard to understand how you're measuring influence. So how do you know that just because they score high in the metrics that they are honestly influential in any particular situation? Even though these might help you understand maybe the reach that somebody has or the number of people that might see what it is that's going on. So if you look at how clout is measured, it looks at what the true reach is, which is kind of how many people in my network might see a message, and then maybe in secondary networks of theirs. You look at amplification, which is how many people tend to send on the things that I say. And you look at the network of all the different followers out there. And so you look at all those things and you say, okay, so this is how it adds up that I get a 45. But the truth is, how do you know these things? How do you know that that really shows influence? And is it really true that no matter what I post on Twitter, I'm equally influential each time? Of course I'm not. But each time I post, someone could check my clout score and it would be relatively the same. It'd be 45 today, maybe it's 47 tomorrow. It's going to be in that area. And so how do we focus on what really is influence? Because what we want to know about influence is what influences someone to do something. So we need to really think through these kinds of questions. So one of the things we want to ask is, are you trying to measure how action is influenced? Or are you trying to measure how opinion is influenced? They might not be the same. Somebody might have a high opinion of your company but not buy anything. And is there a difference between influence and popularity? Right now, a lot of the influencer scores are really about popularity. They're about what I would call amplification. So how many people see what you say. It's a little harder to measure true influence, to measure what it is that causes people to do things. But I think that's where we're going. I think that network analysis is going to allow us to look deep into networks and not just see which things have been tweeted and retweeted, but also see what the behavior patterns are of people exposed to certain messages. So just as I talked earlier about the patterns of different marketing messages that people might be exposed to and being able to identify which patterns seem to cause more conversions than others, I think you can do the same thing with influence. So which patterns tend to be associated with higher conversions? And how deep in the network should you look? Should you look second order, third order? So how far do you look to see what the effects are before you start to reach diminishing returns? I think those are all questions that we're going to be grappling with in the next few years as we try to identify what influence means. Fifth trend, touched on this a bit earlier, real locations. So the state of location right now is reverse IP lookup for geographic locations, but there's another kind of location that people rely on a lot when they're dicing web analytics, which is mobile versus what I'll call stationary. So they a lot of times they ask, well, how much mobile activity are you getting on your site? But is that activity truly mobile? Where I would define mobile as being out of the house and out of the office. You're not sitting somewhere in one place, you're out and about. But that's not how we measure mobile today. Today, computers are always considered to be stationary, and cell phones, tablet computers like iPads, those are all mobile. But the truth is that you could have your computer with you while you're traveling, and you could be sitting on your couch with your iPad. And so, which of those activities were truly mobile? And I think that we've kind of glossed over the definition of what mobile really means that would be helpful to make marketing decisions, and we've just turned it into a kind of proxy for devices. That's, I mean, it's not bad to understand what kinds of devices are coming to your site, but to call those things mobile doesn't, it seems like it really misses the point. And I think that we need to think through how we can really understand the location of people. So how can we really get location data? So for tweets and for other kinds of social network situations, Facebook has Facebook Places. There's all sorts of ways to do this. You can have your physical location appended every time you update your social network. But at the moment, very few people do this. There are also location-based social networks like Gowalla and Foursquare, and those are really based on location. So those are things where you can check in at a particular location. Sometimes there are marketing incentives associated with that. So all of these things are ways of us understanding the physical location of people. And we've talked before about how reverse IP lookup can give you some location data, but it's not as precise as these check-in facilities. Mobile phones, as we talked about earlier, can reveal locations that are more precise. The most precise ones are based on GPS coordinates, but some kinds of triangulation algorithms that identify the nearby cell towers and look at the strength of signal to each tower, they can actually do a fairly good job of identifying where mobile phones are as well. And so as a higher and higher percentage of activity starts to be identified from a location point of view, it might give us more ability to segment by that kind of data. The next trend I want to talk about briefly is predictive modeling. So what does that mean? It means that we're not just analyzing the data to make decisions. We're not even just analyzing it for the computer to automatically make a decision on the spot of, for example, what we want to show, but we're actually using it to predict what's going to happen next. So we talked in a little bit about a kind of predictive modeling. If you can identify patterns that seem to lead to success, well, if you see someone exhibiting that kind of pattern, then you might be able to predict, the percentage chance that they're actually going to convert. And one way to think about it is perhaps you could watch the pattern, and as their percentage goes up or down, you might actually adjust the offer. Maybe if their percentage starts to go down, you lower the price. Maybe if it starts to go up, you don't. All those kinds of things might be possible in the future. There are already people trying to make predictions of movement of stock prices based on looking at the volume and the sentiment of tweets. Now, I don't know how successful they are, but it's clear to me that part of the future of web analytics will be about predictive modeling, not just about explaining the past or helping decision making. The seventh trend that I see is that there is more and more pressure on the venerable identification method called cookies. So you there are many different kinds of cookies. There are browser cookies, there are flash cookies, there are all sorts of new methods that seem to pop up all the time. The newer browsers are allowing consumers to set up rules that limit cookying. And every release of browsers provides more ability for users to do that. There are regulations that are popping up in Europe and in other places that are prohibiting cookies in some areas. That might happen in more areas. And so the question we have to ask is, if the cookie is crumbling, what are we going to do about it? So I would argue that relationships have to be the key. They are the antidote to cookying. Cookying is something that is somewhat intrusive. It's the kind of thing that while some people totally understand what's going on, they are accepting the cookies because they like the convenience and they get it. It probably means that for others who find this to be creepy or who go out of their way to prevent cookies from tracking them, we may need to come up with incentives that cause them to identify themselves in other ways. So they can continue to shut cookies off as they browse the web, but when they get to our site, they are giving us permission so that we can know who they are. So there are a lot of sites that do this already. Amazon is probably the king, where from the very beginning, the ease with which you could check out was enhanced if you were logged in. You began to get personalized offers of what kinds of books you might be interested in. So for all those reasons, people have become very comfortable with Amazon as a company that they are happy that you know who they are and what kinds of books they read and what would be interesting to them. And so all those things are things that customers have gotten used to. And so if you provide value, and then the customer will grant that relationship, and then you have the ability to find out who they are. But if you're not providing that value and relying on cookies to be able to kind of force your way into that, I'd say that that might have a limited lifespan. Our eighth trend we touched on earlier: decisions, not reports. So we talked about this. Business people don't want analytics, they want to make better decisions. And so we have to think about what turns data into insight. And it's not just business people. As we talked about earlier, it's business people and it's automated decisions. So how do we get those automated decisions to happen as well? So between the business people, between the computers, how do we get the data to them so that they make better decisions? What are the things that allow us to be decision provokers rather than mere number crunchers? So how can web analysts provide actionable data, data that causes people to do things, data that allows computers to make real-time decisions rather than just providing reports? This is a critical question that every analyst has to ask, because if you're not providing that kind of value, eventually you might be looked upon as overhead, or you might be looked upon as someone who's just not providing the value commensurate with what you're being paid. And so it's critical that you really drill into these kinds of questions and you make sure that you're facilitating decisions. You're not just dumping numbers into reports. Trend 9 is one I think is really interesting. Automated optimization. So we looked earlier in the course at multivariate testing. So A/B testing, multivariate testing, where there are many, many different possibilities, and the computer can do analysis that will help you understand who's the best, which is the best option for you to go with. And so all that's well and good, but there's still a lot of human work in the loop. There's human work to understand what the different options that ought to be presented are, and there's human work to make the decision and to actually change the version of the website so that it's providing that winning option. What if the computer could do more of that? Could the computer actually automatically create some of these tests? Like suppose you're trying to test the price, the optimum price. Couldn't the computer do that? Couldn't it vary things a little bit and see what the test is without any human intervention? And couldn't it go ahead and update the site so it was constantly showing the most optimum price? Couldn't it do that even based on segments, so it was doing the price dynamically all the time? Couldn't the computer take the 20 different images that you have for the product and cycle them through by itself? I mean, you already took the pictures, you have them all, it's not like you have to do a lot of work to do this. Aren't there many ways today that the computer can identify what the right options are to test and then follow through and actually show the results of the test? I'm working with one company now that's doing some of this. I think there's going to be many more companies that start to do this, and I think these are the kinds of things that you're going to see in the future. It's not just going to be today's multivariate testing. It's going to be things that computers can do automatically. Now, another thing that we might want to look at is tactic attribution. So I know you're familiar with attribution, which is identifying which marketing tactic was the one that caused a conversion or a visit. And so today's models use rules. There are rules that go back deep into the history of of direct marketing. So for a long time, direct marketing is focused on attribution because there are many different direct marketing tactics that could lead to a sale. And those systems are called matchback systems. They use rules that are approximated by people. So tomorrow's system might actually use machine learning to discern patterns. We've talked a number of times about pattern identification. I think that's going to be one of the real mega trends in analytics, is to be using machine learning to look at the big aggregate of data and to do pattern matching in order to identify which are the ones that seem to be the most successful, and to try and figure out how we can get more people to follow those successful patterns. In this case, for tactic attribution, I think we could look at the patterns of which marketing messages people were exposed to. And over time, we could tease out through multivariate testing and through machine learning which factors seem to be most highly associated with conversions. And by doing that, that would allow us to then update our attribution models that would then allow us to optimize based on those updated models. Because if we then know which particular marketing messages appear to be the most valuable, then we can begin to spend more money on them. We can begin to give them more rotation slots, and that would allow us to do our allocation of resources better. So the last trend is one that might sound a little bit ominous, but it's really not. But it's what I call the end of web analytics. I believe that in the not too distant future, we won't think of web analytics as being a separate discipline. I think that even calling it web analytics today kind of obscures some of what web analysts usually focus on, because they're really not web analysts anymore, they're digital analysts. They're people who are just as confident analyzing social media and display advertising and mobile marketing as things that are actually occurring on a website. And so even web analytics probably today you would need to call digital analytics. But I'm making an even bigger point that web analytics is going to be absorbed by other things that we're familiar with, whether it's business intelligence, whether it's customer relationship marketing, whether it's direct marketing. Web analysis will become a feature of those things. It's something you have to have in order to have a world-class BI system or a world-class CRM system or a world-class direct marketing operation. You have to have web analytics. And so I think it will get to the point where web analytics is not really thought of as a distinct specialty. It's something that becomes part of a much larger picture that tries to look at all the different digital touch points across venues, all the offline activity, and it'll use that both for customer relationship management and for business intelligence. And in some businesses, you won't be thinking of it as CRM, you'll instead be thinking of it as direct marketing. And so all of those things are going to need web analytics, and I think that those are the things that we're going to see web analytics turn into. So that's our tour of the future of web analytics. Just want to summarize a few key points. First one is that a lot of what we think of as the future is really here already, but it's not understood yet, or it's just not widely used. I think that the new insights that we're going to see are going to come mainly from linking together content into memes and people, so that we don't just have disparate identities across the web, we actually know who people are. I think that automated analysis is going to begin to eclipse what human beings can do. We talked a little bit about how pattern discernment through multivariate testing and machine learning already eclipses human beings. We're going to see a lot more of that. And the last point, which I really want to emphasize, is that web analytics is a silo, and it's becoming too important to remain that way. And so even though you've gotten all this great training in web analytics, and now you're ready to go out and be a successful web analyst, don't get too comfortable in that role. It's an important role, it's a growing role, there's many people that need that, but if you're a young person at the beginning of your career, you're not going to be a web analyst at the end of your career, even if it's the perfect job for you and you love it, because you're going to end up moving into things that are more use case oriented. You're going to end up being a business intelligence analyst if you're looking at overall market behavior, or you're going to become a CRM analyst if you're looking at particular customer situations for sales, or a direct marketer if you're looking at broader consumer marketing ideas. So depending on how the web analytics are being used, you're probably going to become both more specialized in your use case and more general in where you get your data from, and it'll go far beyond the web. So that's it, everybody. I appreciate you taking the time to listen to this lesson and for paying attention for all 10 lessons in this course. Dr. Pahwa and I are happy to answer more questions on the forum or even email, and thanks again for your time. I hope it was valuable for you.